understand the mystery. First take a look at the history. The words we use will give us clues. So join us now in Church Chatter.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Church Chatter podcast, where we unpack a different church word or phrase each week. I'm Sam. I have my doctorate in language and culture, and I study religious linguistics.
And I'm Dillon. I have a Master of Divinity, and I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor.
This is episode 24, and it's about the Romans. And there's a lot of reasons we're doing this. The Romans have a lot to do with the Lenten story, journey, however you want to refer to it. The Easter story, Lent. But also, Dillon and I were just in Rome, Italy, and the Vatican City, so we thought this week would be a good time to do an episode on the Romans. So, one of the hills, Dillon already knows this, but one of the hills that I will die on is that the Jesus story cannot be fully understood without situating Jesus' life within the political context of his day. Do you agree with that?
I do.
There we go. So, as Christians, we believe Jesus was God incarnate. Go back and listen to our kenosis episode to learn more what that means and what that kind of refers to. But Jesus was God made flesh, right? If you're a Christian, that's one of the things that we believe. Jesus was God in human form. What makes this really beautiful, I think, is that was very specific. Jesus was a particular person. He was a boy born of a particular woman. He had a particular family. He had siblings. He had friends. He was a skilled tradesperson. He was educated as a Jewish rabbi. He grew up in a Jewish family. He was a part of a Jewish community. He grew up in Nazareth 2,000 years ago in the Middle East. He lived about 33 years. He had a very specific kind of life. Jesus was a specific person, and as a specific person, he lived at a certain point in history. So all of that is really important because at that point in history, during that time in history, in that place of history, right, his homeland was conquered by Romans about 6 or 7 decades before Jesus was born. The Romans came in and they conquered his homeland. So the Romans controlled Jesus and his fellow Jews. There were Roman soldiers all around Jesus' homeland. So today we are going to talk about the Romans during Jesus' lifetime because the Romans, you need to understand what was going on with the Roman Empire and the Romans in order to fully comprehend what was going on during Lent and the Easter story, right?
Right.
So anything to add to that introduction?
No.
So first, let's talk about the Romans and Jesus. Herod, who wanted to kill all of the babies under the age of 2, right? Under the age of 2, because Jesus was born and he was said to be the king of the Jews, right? Herod didn't like that. Herod was a Roman. He had Roman control, right? So even just before Jesus was even born.
He wasn't fully Roman, though. He
Talk about that.
So King Herod was of his parents. One of them was of Roman culture and Roman blood, and then the other one was Jewish, and so he wasn't fully Jewish, but he had enough Jewish culture and blood in him that he was able to be the Roman appointed king of the Jews, and so but he was very much a puppet king. He was also historically very tyrannical.
Yeah.
Not too many people have, even historians that are not of the Christian persuasion are not overly. I shouldn't say not overly kind, but I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah.
They're not overly favorable in uplifting King Herod's time on the throne.
Well, let's actually situate that because I think that's important. So Herod was Roman appointed. He was king of the Jews. If you look at that face value, it's like, oh, he was Jewish. In fact, he ruled over the Jewish people. He was king of the Jews, right? But he was Roman appointed. And that's not that different from what's going on now, right? With, like, in the context of Christianity, we see some Christians using their Christianity in a very frightening way to get political power, right? So it's not that different from what we do now, and have done every generation between Jesus's birth and now, right? Mm-hmm. Anything else to say about King Herod?
No.
So he was Roman appointed, meaning the Romans, about 6 or 7 decades, so 6 years, I think, was it like 67 years before Jesus was born, I think, is whenever the Romans conquered the Jewish land.
Yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So
approximately.
Six or 7 decades before Jesus was born, the Romans conquered the land that Jesus eventually lived on, right, and was a part of.
And I'm just reminded also about Herod, about King Herod, is that so some scholars actually believe that he may not have had any Jewish culture, Jewish race, Jewish religion in him from his birth, that he either inherited it or he received it after his birth. So he wasn't. Some people, the more kind of general thing is that he was one parent was Roman, the other one was Jewish, but he was always in the culture of Herodian Judaism. Mm-hmm. And Herodian Judaism was a type of more of an understanding of Greek-centered Judaism, and Greek-centered Judaism, so you didn't have as much emphasis on the Hebrew language and the Hebrew tradition, and the Herodians were a group that were much more... to kind of use a modern term, much more secular in their understanding of Judaism.
Also much more willing to be in cahoots with the Romans who conquered them.
The
were
Romans.
Oppressing them. Yeah. So all of that is to say, Herod was Roman appointed, right? He was in cahoots. I like that word, cahoots. Yeah. He was in cahoots with the Romans who were oppressing a lot of Jews, right? And then there was rumor, the story that we have says that there was rumor that there was a boy who was going to be born and he was going to be king of the Jews. Herod was king of the Jews. And like a lot of people who find themselves in a very powerful position and they gain wealth and fame and respect and a military to protect them, that can be quite addicting, right? That can actually become idolatry. But we really got to do a whole episode on idolatry here soon because we talk about it a lot. But Herod liked his power and he became pretty evil. We talked about this on an episode. He killed his wife, or he had his wife killed.
He had his wife killed, and he was well known for quickly putting people to death, executing people, and he was very much which many people were of this time, unfortunately, but he was very much into torturing people.
Yes. Well, so the story goes, the story we have in the Bible is that he had baby boys under the age of 2 killed for a while because he didn't want this supposed king of the Jews to come about. Now, there is no historical evidence that actually happened. However, it wouldn't have been commonplace for every evil thing that a king or a ruler did to be logged. A lot of the evil things that he did was logged, but some of them were much more gruesome than killing many, I would assume thousands of boys under 2. So although there's not historical evidence, there wasn't historical evidence for every single decision made by a ruler.
Right, so. So there is no historical evidence outside of the New Testament about the killing of the firstborn Jewish boys. It is logged and documented in the New Testament, in the Gospels in particular, but there seems to be not an ample amount of evidence for it outside of the biblical narrative, and yet there is ample evidence that this would have been something that King Herod was very capable of.
Right, within his character.
So it wasn't like, oh, this doesn't really match. And what's interesting about that, real quick, is there is I like the word motif.
Yeah.
There is a theme and a double-sided motif between this story of the tyrannical, evil King Herod who is appointed and kind of siding with the Roman Empire, and the firstborn killing of the Jewish boys, which he was hoping Jesus would be a part of that, but Jesus obviously escaped that because of the Holy Family, Mary and Joseph, escaping that. And in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures, you see the same motif with the Pharaoh, the Egyptian Pharaoh, killing the firstborn boys, and you see Moses escaping.
Yeah, that's good.
So there's a
parallel.
There's a parallel there.
Yeah. So we say all of this about King Herod killing baby boys because he was trying to kill Jesus. That's the story that we have, right? And he was Roman appointed. So right at the beginning, you see Romans. Romans conquered the Jewish land. They were in charge, right? In control. They were oppressing people, which we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And right away, a Roman appointed leader wanted to kill Jesus. And then during Jesus's lifetime, the Romans continued to have a military presence everywhere. So picture your life right now. You're walking to the store. You're walking from your car in the parking lot into a doctor's appointment. You're going outside and taking a walk in your town. Picture armed guards on your streets, but the guards are the guards of another nation. And they are not there to protect you, but to control you. This is the society Jesus grew up in, right? There were Roman militia everywhere.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, there's a train coming through our town, so you might hear it. So this is the society Jesus grew up in, right? There were Roman militia everywhere. And these Romans were of another nation who conquered Jesus's nation, right? So just to kind of situate it, really sink into that, that's kind of alarming. So the Romans conquered the Jews, the Romans took their land, and then the Romans taxed them a lot, right? There's something called triple tax, and it's estimated by a lot of scholars that the Jews were being taxed up to 90% of their income. That's a lot, right? We now, I've heard the number like 12%, like, 12% tax. Not to say that's not a lot, but 90% of your income is being taken, 90% of your resources are being taken from the Romans. The Romans took their land, not just the whole nation, but if a Jewish family owned land or lived on land, the Romans would take it. And then this Jewish family was left without land. So the Jews were really struggling to survive under this oppression, right? They needed this land to have their animals, to eat, to have like a small farm, to have a garden, whatever it is, right? To eat, to have food to sell and trade in the market. They couldn't survive. So if you think about Jesus's childhood and how he witnessed this growing up, you can see why Jesus talks so much in the Bible about the rich being a problem. Because the Romans were the rich and they were the problem, right? Jesus is speaking out against the Romans. They were the ones oppressing. They were the ones with the wealth. And then let's just fast forward a little bit to Pontius Pilate sentencing Jesus to death. He was a Roman governor. He was a politician, right? Roman politicians killed Jesus because Jesus's message was not only religious, it was political, right? If he was just speaking out against the Jewish religious people, the temple, the Romans wouldn't have really cared because they kind of just let the Jews, when the Romans conquered a group, they let them keep their religion as long as they made sacrifices and prayed to their gods for the Romans, which I think is interesting. But the Romans didn't really care. Like, okay, you can have your faith, you can have your temple. So if Jesus was just talking out against the Jewish elite, the Romans wouldn't have cared. Jesus was obviously being anti-Rome. He had a political message. Otherwise, the Romans wouldn't have killed him, right? I think that's interesting. Do you have anything to add to that?
No.
So, do you remember our episode, Turn the Other Cheek? Do you remember that? It was
I
a
do.
while ago. I think it was like episode 3. It's one of my favorites. We talked about how the Roman soldiers were allowed to order Jews to carry things up to 1 mile in that episode. So when the Bible tells us that somebody helped Jesus carry his cross, this is because a Roman soldier ordered a Jew to carry Jesus' cross to keep this process of crucifixion moving along efficiently, right? So this is really important. The Romans, the Roman Empire, they're the ones who carried out the execution. Pontius Pilate was a Roman. The Romans nailed Jesus to a cross. Roman soldiers were there when Jesus died. They were also there whenever the tomb was rolled away and Jesus wasn't there. There were Roman soldiers, right? So let's talk about Romans in the temple quickly. So the Romans also influenced the Jewish temple, right? There were tensions between the Jews because some Jews were becoming Romanized. And a lot of Jews didn't like that. Jesus did not like it. There were Jewish people who were partnering with the Romans because they wanted wealth and power too. King Herod, at the time when Jesus was born, was one of them. And Jesus was speaking out against this. This is why the Bible is often very specific about discussing different Jewish factions like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, right? Because there were different Jews who had different ideas about how exactly to act out against the Romans. Most of them agreed that the Romans were a problem. Some of them didn't. Some of them partnered with the Romans, but most of them agreed, I think.
You also have the Essenes,
right.
and the Essenes along. So you have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and the Essenes. And the Essenes were an interesting one. They're not exactly by any means monastic, but and monastic means someone who takes a vow and they live in community. Mm-hmm. And Essenes were people that they literally left society and they went into the wilderness and they lived together in communes. And they had all different types of very strict practices. They were a part of it. Their whole life was to resist which was more towards in the larger towns and cities, resist the empire and flee into the wilderness.
Yeah, that's good.
So you have that.
Well, and again, you might think like, oh, this is 2,000 years ago. It's the same now. If you look at Christianity now, there are a lot of different ways to be a Christian. Just like during Jesus' lifetime, there were a lot of ways to be a Jew. And these Jews had different ideas about how to engage with the oppressive political powers. Just like today, if you're in the Christian world, you can see it very clearly. There are a lot of Christians who have very different ideas about what we do in the face of oppressive political power.
Well, yeah, we have talked about this multiple times on multiple episodes. There was unity within the Jewish faith, but there was never uniformity.
Right.
I mean, there was always, as you said, factions.
And these factions often called each other out and didn't agree and were debating how to move forward, which is exactly what religion continues to do today.
And yet all Jewish.
And yet all Jewish, right? Mm-hmm. So many Jewish groups were against the Romans, but they had different ideas of how to act out against the Romans. Some were more violent in their methods. I think the Zealots are known for being pretty direct, right?
Well, they were known as bringing about violence.
Yes. Yeah. So some were violent, some were more passive and just kind of like, whatever, just like today, right? However, Jesus, he was not somebody who I'll say this, there was violence. He was what you could call violent sometimes, right? Like flipping tables. He used some vulgar language sometimes. However, that was very few and far between. And for the most part, he advocated peace while still calling out injustices, right? In a very loving way. So he kind of saw through this ping pong match of like returning violence for violence. And instead he taught his followers to radically include, this is important, his teachings. If you go through the 4 Gospels and read them, you'll see this over and over and over again. When he says love your enemy, I'm not saying you should hate those with political power, but he's not saying love the Roman Empire. He's saying love the people the Roman Empire is failing to include and the ones the Romans are harming. He's saying love the people at the bottom of the pyramid. He's not saying, oh, peace, love, harmony, love everybody even when they're doing harm. That's not what he's saying. He's saying we need to include the people who the Romans are harming. So that's why the Samaritans, that's why women, that's why, pick your poison. There's so many.
I even think about in the book of Acts, you have St. Philip, one of the Jesus' disciples, followers. You have him baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch.
Yeah.
And eunuchs, if you know anything about eunuchs, they were not overly tolerated. And when they were tolerated, they were enslaved people for the most part, and they were seen as sexually either deviant or they were sexually impure, and so nobody really wanted to deal with them. And you have this very, very clear. So Jesus's teachings, especially in that passage from Acts, in which you see Philip baptizing, which is a big deal. The whole idea of baptism is entering into the Jesus movement, entering into what we would now know as the church. And those are the teachings of Jesus to open.
And we did a whole episode on baptism, so go back and listen to that too, because it talks about baptism as a way, once again, to cleanse yourself from the evils of the Roman Empire. Again, it's all connected to the Romans.
And Jesus knew a lot about people on the margins, women, children, the disabled, those who were sick and dying, eunuchs. Yeah. A lot of these people, they weren't even. So Jesus was obviously a historic Jew, and he practiced Judaism as his religion, but he was well aware of some of these practices of these people on the margins. Even though Judaism called for the care of those people, they excluded them also in very many ways. And
oh my gosh, the lepers. I always forget the lepers.
Yeah, the lepers. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you would see that in the Jewish courts in the temple, these people who were on the margins, they would have to be on the external levels of the temple. They were not permitted to be close within the temple. And Jesus is basically saying, I always think of that, Jesus in his healing ministry, in this Roman time, in this time of not welcoming people to the table or not, he's literally, the whole idea that someone would touch a leper in Jesus's time was wild, was radical.
Yes.
The idea that you would include women and children into this movement, this group, the idea that you have to touch someone to baptize. I know that sounds weird, but you have to touch someone to baptize them. Mm-hmm. You're baptizing a eunuch. So Jesus's teachings were so anti-Roman Empire. They were also really, really calling for a reform of the then current Jewish religion.
Yeah. Something that I have learned recently that I'm pretty obsessed with, so you'll probably hear me repeat it a couple times, is if you read Exodus, when Moses is trying to liberate the Israelites from the Pharaoh in Egypt, the Bible says, and you can read it in so many translations, the Bible doesn't say that the Pharaoh's heart was hard. It says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And that has bothered me since I entered Christianity. That has bothered me for so long. Dillon is laughing because he knows this. It has bothered me. What do you mean? It's clear God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And I have recently read a couple people say, yeah, that's because God chooses a side and it's not the side of the powerful. God hardens Pharaoh's heart because Pharaoh's not willing to see the oppression. So God hardens Pharaoh's heart because that's God choosing a side. And that's very hard for me, because sometimes the all-loving God that we are taught about, and I even will say that I've experienced in moments, you don't want God to pick a side. But then I think, well, but if you read the whole Bible and people's experiences of God, and even my experiences now, yeah, God picks a side, and it's not the side with the power, it's the side of the oppressed. Over and over and over again. It happened in Exodus, and whenever we see God showing up fully in Jesus, it's Jesus too. Jesus picks a side, and it's not the people with the political power. He's not on the side of the kings and the emperors. He's on the side of the people that these people are harming. And I think that's important to say.
I also would like to say that I am a person who does not hold a very high, how do I want to say this?
A high view of...
I don't hold a very high view of free will and choice.
Me neither.
Neither does the Lutheran Church. Much to maybe people's surprise. Free choice and the doctrine of free will is not something that's high on my totem pole. I don't really. I'm not saying we have no free will, but I think it's very limited. And the Lutheran theology also agrees with that. But here's the interesting thing: in the story of the Pharaoh of Egypt. And the conversation between the Pharaoh of Egypt and Moses and liberating the people in the Exodus story. So yes, God hardens his heart because Pharaoh, as as we are told, is a rather stubborn person, and yet there was also opportunities for him to repent, to turn from his ways, as we speak about specifically in the season of Lent that we're in right now, to turn from his ways. And it's hard for me to see that he ultimately in that story did not. But that does not mean that there is a total loss of hope for him.
No, I'm going to get downright poetic here for a minute.
Are you?
Hard hearts are easier to break.
Right.
And as
they're brittle.
Yes, they're brittle. And as most of us know, transformation doesn't happen until your heart is broken. And once you have a soft heart, it's harder to break your heart because it's just always broken open a little bit. Does that make sense? I know that sounds very poetic and abstract, but that's one of the truths of life. We all know those people who are walking around like, I'm so tough. I'm so tough and my heart is hardened. No, you are so close to a breakdown and a breakthrough, honestly, because those two things happen simultaneously. You are protecting yourself from something. So maybe in some poetic way, in some mysterious way, the Pharaoh's heart was hardened, yes, because God chooses a side. But hearts have to be hardened so that they can break all of this and shattered, because that's when we transform. That's when we can be remade into something more loving and kind and able to see perspectives of those who are being harmed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
And I also think that it's interesting because in that Exodus story in particular, as to what has been recorded and we're told, is that water both gives life and it takes life.
Right.
And so it is through water that Moses and the Israelites came to a new land, a land flowing with milk and honey, right? And they were given life through the water, just like we're given new life through the waters of baptism.
Yep.
It wakes us up. And at the same time, in that story, you have Pharaoh and his soldiers on chariots going through the water and being consumed.
Yeah.
And so that you could just end the story there, say, okay, they were consumed, they died, yada yada, and yet water is both a giver of life and a cleanser and a cleanser. So that there is this. There's many theologians that say that in those waters, yes, he had a physical death, meaning Pharaoh, but also you could see that as God restoring him,
yes,
and literally saying, you might think that you're in charge and you might want to do what you want to do.
Yeah.
But
well, we're on a side tangent.
Yeah, there's still hope.
Yes, but a side tangent to this side tangent, because sometimes I think they're the most interesting, is you know how people sometimes in their homes, they have those signs that say fear God, right? The fear God, all those things. Another just as accurate way to translate that is to be in awe of God. That Hebrew word for fear, another way to say that is to be in awe. And whenever I see those signs, fear God, I used to hate them, but now I just do this real quick translation in my head. It's almost instantaneous now. This is what happens inside me when I see a sign, or I not older, but different translations of the Bible say fear God. And whenever I see that anywhere, what happens in my head is be in awe of God. And then I picture myself standing at an ocean, looking out into the water, and that feeling of wow, it's so cleansing, it's so beautiful, it's so freeing when you look at it, and yet it could kill you. It's quite dangerous, right? It's quite mysterious. That's not to say oh, God's going to kill you. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it's dangerous, it's mysterious. We don't know much about what's underneath there. It could really pull you under, right? It could really consume you. And so that's that feeling of being in awe. It's so beautiful, but it's also very big and to be taken seriously.
Well, and water too, especially obviously in the ocean, water is constantly regenerating itself.
Yes.
So anything that it consumes, it regenerates into something into
Yeah.
something. So basically, what I'm trying to say is there may be a little bit of a time of correction, and yet at the same time, there's always restoration.
Yeah. So back to the Romans. We talked about how the Romans took over before Jesus was born. We talked about the Romans during his death. We talked about how the Romans were there during his lifetime and how his teachings were really anti-Roman. And I'm going to give an example of that in a couple minutes. But first, let's talk about the Romans and the destruction of the temple, because this is really important to understand the four Gospels. So let's fast forward to after Jesus' life. He was killed. The Romans killed him. They were there. In Rome last week, Dillon and I actually saw, because it's Lent, but it's also Jubilee year. So for Lent, we saw in Rome, Italy, a lot of depictions of the crucifixion and the Passion account, because it's Lent, right? And most of these paintings and sculptures and pieces of art, they included the Romans, and that's not something we see very often. But in Rome, they had it everywhere. There were Roman soldiers because they were there, and we can't forget that, right? A Roman politician sentenced Jesus to death. Roman soldiers are the ones who nailed him to the cross. Roman soldiers were the ones who ordered another Jew to pick up Jesus' cross with him and help him. Roman soldiers were on duty at the foot of the cross the moment Jesus died. Roman soldiers were also there when the tomb was rolled away and Jesus' body was gone, right? Roman soldiers were there for all of that. And in the art that we saw in Rome, they had Roman soldiers. Like there was a cross with Jesus on it and two other crosses with people on it. One of them was the thief on the cross, remember? And the Romans were there. There were 2 or 3 Romans just on duty there watching people die on the crosses, including Jesus. So the Romans were there. These politicians were there, right? It's really important to remember.
There was this, in the one particular church and the Church of St. Mary the Virgin that we went
Was
to.
that in the Vatican City?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So it was this, the church was outside of St. Peter's Square. It was kind of on one of the main streets of the Vatican City, and it was the Church of St. Mary the Virgin, and it was a beautiful church outside and a even more gorgeous church inside. But it was interesting, for Lent they had these, what would you call them? They were like little
display cases.
Little display cases. So
they almost looked like giant fish tanks.
Yeah, so
they had these displays.
Yeah, the church had multiple
like 15 of
multiple stations set up, and
it's like a mini museum.
It was like a little mini museum, and they were all lit up. And these were like a clay sculpted figures that were painted, and
they were impressive.
They were very impressive, and they told the whole story from
Palm Sunday.
From
no, it started before that.
Yeah, no, Palm Sunday.
No, because they had a Last Supper one, remember?
Yeah, but
Palm Sunday is before.
Palm
right.
Sunday, and then they had the Last Supper, and they had the crucifixion, the washing of the feet, and then they had the crucifixion and the burial, and then they had the Easter, the resurrection story, and
the Romans were in a lot of them.
Yeah, because that's
historical.
It's not only historical, but it's also it's a part of the story in the scriptures, and
it's biblical.
It's biblical. Yeah, very good. Oh boy, and so that was just a very nice art exhibit.
It made me feel justified because it's one of the things that I told you in the beginning of this episode. It's one of the hills I will die on. The Romans were there. The Jesus story is just as much a story about spirituality and religion and inner transformation as it is about politics. They were there. They were part of it. They were the reason the Jesus story is the way that it is, and I think that's important.
Yeah.
So, after the resurrection and the earthly life of Jesus, is that the right way to say it? Things continued to escalate. So Jesus died. The Romans were there throughout all of it. Jesus died. He resurrected. All that happened. And then life continued. And there were more and more Jesus followers coming into Jesus communities. Christianity didn't exist yet. We'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But things continued to escalate. The Romans were growing more rich, while many Jews continued to suffer and have their land taken from them, their income, their resources taken from them. Romans continued to increase taxes and take land from Jewish families. Many of these families, again, they needed that land to grow food and to have housing over their heads, right? And in this Roman society, when a Jew or anybody couldn't house themselves or feed themselves, they would become enslaved to a Jewish family, right? They didn't have social systems like they didn't have welfare systems. They didn't have these things yet. So how did they account for people who couldn't support themselves? They enslaved them. And I mean, that's just gruesome. That's terrible. Their life was taken from them. They were taken away from their families. Families were separated. They were enslaved, and that's what it was. And especially considering it was no fault of their own, going back to this choice thing. These Jews didn't choose to have their land taken from them. They didn't choose to not be able to grow their own food or have anything to trade and sell in the marketplace. They had no choice. The Romans came in, took them, taxed them a lot. They couldn't pay their taxes. They didn't have a home. They couldn't feed themselves, so they became enslaved. They were separated from their families. It's terrible. So the Romans kept getting richer. They kept taking more from the Jews. Tensions were growing. And eventually, the Jews... Let me actually just add something. I don't know if I've said this in an episode yet, but this is really telling. There are historical documents that show there was an actual, what we would call a committee meeting today, but there was a committee meeting. There was a meeting among Romans, and they decided that it was up for discussion. Should we have Jewish slaves, or just any enslaved people in the Roman Empire? Should we have uniforms for them? And the Romans decided no, because if we make it visibly obvious how many people are enslaved in the Roman Empire, they might know how many exist and they might revolt. And that's really horrifying that like the Romans consciously and bureaucratically made the decision, no, we can't give uniforms to our enslaved people, because if we do, they'll know and they can rise up against us. That's crazy. And that's wild to me. So it was very systematic, right? So tension was growing. And then eventually, so remember, Jesus died in the 30s. Eventually, the Jews fought against the Romans in what is now called the First Jewish Revolt. And this happened in the year 66. So about 30 years or so after Jesus was killed. Tensions kept growing. There were these Jewish communities that were starting to gather to take care of each other. Eventually that became called Christianity, but Christianity didn't exist yet. And the Jewish people revolted against the Romans because, I mean, to put it bluntly, they were pissed. They were tired of being taken advantage of. They were tired of the taxes. They were tired of being enslaved. They were tired of their loved ones being enslaved and taken from them, and they couldn't see them anymore, right? Everything was just terrible. So in the year 66, the Jews, I wouldn't say they won, but they did fight and they took control over Jerusalem. So there was a little victory there. And in Jerusalem, Jewish people had freedom from the Romans for 4 years. And then in the year 70, the Romans took back Jerusalem. They destroyed the Second Temple. So this is the famous destruction of the Second Temple. And they destroyed the Jewish population. And the violence of this cannot be overstated, and we have to situate the Bible within this violence. So around the year 70, the Romans took back Jerusalem. The temple was set on fire. Jewish people were slaughtered by Romans in mass numbers. There was sexual violence against women. The surviving Jews were marched naked into the city in a parade before they were sold at slave markets and given to Jewish families for labor. So we were at the Colosseum in Rome, and this was built by these enslaved Jews after the First Jewish Revolt. And this was only about between 30 and 40 years after the death of Jesus. And all of this occurred, well, a quick side note is, we don't know this for sure, but it's possible that some of the Jews that Jesus knew, now they would have been perhaps kids when Jesus was wandering and teaching, but they might have been the enslaved Jewish people who were building the Colosseum, which is interesting to think about. So all of this occurred. The temple was destroyed. The Jewish people were abused and killed by the masses and marched naked into the city and then sold at slave markets and given to Jewish families for exploited labor, right? Enslaved labor. All this occurred because of the same things that Jesus was speaking out against, the oppression of the Jewish people at the hands of the Roman Empire, right? So I think that's really important to say, because this is really important for the creation of the Bible, especially the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Gospels were written down after the First Jewish Revolt, after the destruction of the temple. All of the Gospels were written down after all of this happened. This horrible thing in history happened. And I know a lot of people like to treat the Bible as if it exists outside of this context, but it doesn't. It exists within this historical context of the Roman and Jewish histories, right? So the Gospels were written down after the first Jewish revolt, which means it was written down when the memories of what the Romans did to the Jews was fresh in the minds and hearts of many. The Romans officially won at this point in history. The Jews stopped revolting and everything got really blurry after. Well, I shouldn't say completely stopped revolting, but it's called the first Jewish revolt for a reason. But things got really kind of muddy here in history. So, anything to add so far? Because I have more to say.
No. Are you going to specifically talk about the different Gospels?
No, but you can.
So,
Well, I just want to say one
go ahead.
quick thing before you do that. So the Gospels were written down after the first Jewish revolt, and so all of these memories were fresh in their minds and their hearts, right? And the Romans officially won. So the Romans effectively were in control of the Roman population now. And the Gospel writers were not about to be bold in their anti-Roman sentiments. And like when Jesus was anti-Rome, they couldn't be very direct about that in the Gospels. But if you read it, I'm going to give it an example in a couple minutes, but the anti-Rome attitude of Jesus and just the New Testament in general is there, 100% it's there, but it doesn't slap you in the face, because if they wrote it down directly and clearly, they would have been punished or killed, because this violence had just happened a couple years ago. Does that make sense the way I explained it?
Yeah, that makes
Okay.
sense.
So I have an example of this. Do you want me to give the example first, or you want to go into the Gospels first?
Well, I just want to say that
Go ahead.
so Mark's Gospel, St. Mark's Gospel, is the first Gospel written, and it is written very early. Some would say around 70, some would say 71, 72. Some people date it a little earlier, but that's a minority take on that. So most people would say that Mark's Gospel comes like right during the fall in 70, or like a year or two after. So that is it's the shortest gospel, and it's also the oldest, and it kind of really focuses on the importance of Jesus's death at the hands of the Romans.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that's the earliest, so written again around 70, 72.
Can I say something really quick? Tell me if I'm wrong. I think this is in Mark. But the crucifixion account, you'll notice that when it's talked about in the Gospels, when they talk about Pontius Pilate, they do say that Pontius Pilate, the Roman politician, is the one who sentenced him, but they make a big deal about fellow Jews being the ones chanting. Like they're trying to put some of the blame.
That's where I was going.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, no, that's good. So you have Mark's Gospel, and then in the middle you have Matthew and Luke. And Matthew and Luke have a lot of similarities, but they have some differences. But by the time you get to John's Gospel, St. John's Gospel, that is the latest, not the oldest, but the latest Gospel. So that Gospel is being written around the year 100.
So when you say the latest, you mean the newest, like the most recent?
Yeah, the most recent, yeah. Mm-hmm. And that Gospel does a little bit of that. If you read the Passion account of Christ in John's Gospel, you are seeing almost a total different lens in
different things are emphasized.
in who put Jesus to death. There is a huge emphasis on the Jewish religious leaders putting him to death in John's Gospel, which is deeply problematic.
Yeah. Well, if you remember when you read it, they say things like Pontius Pilate wasn't sure. They paint Pontius Pilate as like, I don't know, I'm not sure.
Yeah,
they're trying to
water.
Go ahead.
No, they're trying to water it down and
not blame the
and
Romans.
there's historic leanings for why they have done it. And when I mean historic leanings, meaning there were things going on in history that they leaned into so that they could still tell these stories in somewhat of a truthful way, and yet at the same time be in the balance of we know that there's a lot of people that might be reading these.
If Romans find this, it's fine whenever they were just saying it out loud in basements of homes for new Jesus communities who are telling the story of Jesus and how Jesus was against the Romans and their political power. But as soon as you write it down, now they're aware, well, this war just happened and Jews really lost big time and they were killed by the masses, and we're afraid pretty much of, like, we can't be as anti-Rome as Jesus was, because, like, essentially they had, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but they had to be a little creative in the ways they communicated these things, because if the Romans got a hold of it, that could be very dangerous for a lot of people.
And we have to remember...
And that could have been the end of the Jesus movement.
Yes, and to get into the politics of this a little bit, and I know you want to share some of these things, but I think this might help set you up. Crucifixion in the Roman Empire was the death penalty for treason and sedition and high crimes against the empire.
Yes.
Rebellion. It had nothing to do with more religious acts or religious sins of blasphemy, or which would include saying, well, you're the Messiah, or the arrival of the Messiah, which there was a linkage to with Jesus.
Yes, but the Romans didn't care about that.
The Romans didn't care about that.
Well,
so when
wait,
we
can
see,
I stop
hold
you
on.
just... The Romans did care a little bit. They didn't somebody being called a king, because they did emperors. They didn't want a king rising up. But otherwise, they didn't care about the religious implications.
Yes, but Jesus's execution, his death,
his
murder on a Roman cross is not only deeply political, it is a clear statement of Rome didn't want him. Rome didn't like
to the
him.
empire.
They did not like his reforms of the Jewish religion. They did not like his cultural reforms, and they wanted him gone.
Yes, because Jesus was calling a lot of Jews out of partnership with the Romans. And how did the Romans keep control? By appointing people and saying, hey, you Jew. Hey, Herod. Hey, you want some power? I'll give you some. If you don't have some Jews on your payrolls, then you can't control Jerusalem. You can't control the Jewish population. And Jesus was calling people away from that, and he was being successful. He was saying, no. We're not in cahoots with the Romans. We are Jewish people. We have our own way of doing things and arranging things. And it has a lot to do with the Jubilee and forgiving debts. And we don't do taxes the way Romans do taxes. We take care of our people. If you go read the Old Testament, the first 5 books specifically, it's all about how the Jewish people were arranging their lives before the Romans came along and just destroyed it all. And Jesus didn't like that, and he was calling people away from the Roman way, and the Romans didn't like that.
But he was also calling the Jewish people of that day to see the very teachings that they had in their scriptures and to not neglect them. Because they were coming up with new things. Well, you can't do this on the Sabbath day, or you can't touch a leper, or you have to. They were coming up with things that were making it very difficult to take care of everyone. And now Jesus's crucifixion is not only. Some people might believe this, and that's fine. I'm just saying I don't. Jesus's crucifixion, Jesus's execution, his murder, his death, is not only political, and yet it is also deeply, deeply political. Yeah. It is also very much religious and spiritual. When we hear in the text that Christ, that Jesus died for the sins of the world, you have to reorient your mind for a little bit. There was a lot of evil, horrible, sinful things going on through the empire, through what the Jewish elite were doing to the Jewish peasants. There was a lot of this, and Jesus, as this kind of reformer, and as we Christians would see him as the fullness of God, is literally someone who's going to the fullness of martyrdom, of being killed, in order for purification of something new. Number one, taking away the sins of the world, the Lamb of God. We talked about that, and also making a deep religious statement on the cross. for sin and atonement, and yet also seeing this as a deeply political thing, as Rome, you don't have the final say. That's obviously
Yes.
the thing with the Easter story, that this not only does the presence of Christ live on, but also Rome doesn't win.
Right, yeah. And to piggyback off of that, when it's said that Jesus died for the sins of the world, it's not like, oh, I experienced jealousy yesterday and Jesus died for that. If you interpret it that way, fine. But in a deeper, more historical way, when Jesus died for the sins, this is really hard to wrap your mind around. And in my book that comes out next year, I talk about, there's a plug.
Little plug.
I talk about that in a chapter. Jesus dying for the community was him saying, like, similar to what we have today. You think of like Martin Luther King Jr. People who know that, like, I'm teaching this way to protect a certain way of life. His teachings were trying to protect the Jewish way of life, like the way they understood God, the way they were orienting themselves to take care of everybody, this loving, peaceful way of life that Jews were called through Moses to live into. And Jesus was taught this way of life growing up, and then he was a Jewish rabbi, so he was teaching this way of life. When he died for the sins, remember, a lot of Jewish people were leaving this Jewish way of life where you take care of everybody and you love people and you take care of your community. They were leaving this way of life to be in cahoots with the Romans so they could have power and wealth and all these things. Those were the sins that are being talked about. And him dying for those sins is saying, I know that these teachings might get me killed, but I'm going to do it anyway. And then he was killed for it. Does that make sense, the way I'm explaining
absolutely.
it? So to say that Jesus died for your sins, yes, just like Martin Luther King Jr. died
For a cause.
for a cause. Jesus died for a cause. Martin Luther King Jr. died for the sins of white supremacy. Jesus died for the sins of the Roman Empire and of power, oppressive power. So that's what's going on there. It's not this abstract, like, oh, Jesus died for the sins. Yes, and this is quite a very literal, serious thing here. Jesus is willing to go to the grave, and he did, to fight for what was right. Fight for your right to party.
Oh.
Okay, so that's good. Anything
Very good.
else?
No? Yeah.
Okay, so remember I talked about how in the Bible, because of the Gospels, right, which is where we get most of the Jesus stuff, in the 4 Gospels, I have to get back on track here. The anti-Rome attitude was there, but it doesn't slap you in the face, especially from a 2,000-year distance, right? Jesus lived 2,000 years ago at this point, almost. No, 2,000 years ago. So one of our kids is getting up, so you might hear them. But here's an example of what I mean. If we read the Bible today, oftentimes we'll read something and we are understanding it in a way that is totally, I'm just going to say it very directly, wrong. So here's an example. I think 3 Gospels tell this story, but it's in the Gospel somewhere. There's a story about Jesus casting a demon into pigs. And at face value, this is a very weird story. You could either take it literally and think that, like, oh, a man was possessed by a demon and Jesus took the demon out and put it into pigs.
Yeah, that's not at all what
And
it
that
is.
is not at all what it is. Or you could do something else equally as problematic and just be like, this story doesn't matter at all. But it does matter and has everything to do with the Romans. So here's how a story like this that we find in our Bible today, here's how Jews during Jesus' lifetime would have understood this. And like even the earliest Jesus followers, they would have understood this story to be very directly against the Romans. So here's how the story goes. There's this distraught man. And in this story, this distraught man, he lives on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now, if you lived during this time 2,000 years ago in this place, you would have known that on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, there was a military base in this area. Everybody knew there was a big military base. So we know that this distraught man was living very close to Roman soldiers, right? And the Bible doesn't give you all these details. You need some historical context.
Well,
but the
because
original audience knew this. Go ahead.
And I know you laugh at me when I say this, but the Bible wasn't written to us,
Right.
And yet it can be for us. We can still see
can dive
these
deep
stories
into it, yeah.
and see these stories as deeply transformational, even 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
But we're reminded that it was not written to us.
Right. There's no way that when people wrote this stuff down 2,000 years ago that they
Would
thought
have thought
2,000
that
years ago
we'd be
people living
reading it.
across the sea, they didn't even know there was an across the sea called the United States
Right.
of America. They
So
had no
context
idea.
is
and
everything.
English, yeah, they had no idea. So
Context.
context is everything. So this distraught man who's said to be possessed by a demon, right? We know that he lived close to a Roman military base. So this distraught man was living very close to Roman soldiers. And this man who lives near a camp of Roman soldiers, he was unwell. He's distraught, he's suffering, he's tormented, right? And that's what we are told. That's why we're told he has a demon, right? Because he's clearly tormented. He's upset, he's distraught. What are some other words? He's just suffering, he's tormented, right? And here's where it gets interesting. In the Bible, this demon is named Legion. And this isn't a literal demon named Legion. In the Roman army, a legion is a military unit of a few thousand soldiers. And this man lives next to a legion, a military unit of a few thousand soldiers. So this story is full of metaphor pointing back to the Romans. There is not an actual demon running around inside this man. Jews would have understood that this story was saying this man, who lives near a camp of Roman soldiers, is being tormented by the Roman soldiers. He's being tormented by a legion. That's why the demon is named a legion, right? Because that's a military term for thousands of soldiers. He is unwell because of the Romans. So what does Jesus do? And it gets more interesting. What does Jesus do? He casts out this metaphorical demon, meaning the torment from the Romans inflicted onto this man, onto pigs. What is the significance of pigs? Well, remember, Jews did not, and many still don't, eat pork. Pigs were seen as unclean, and pigs were often used in literature or storytelling as a symbol of impurity or even idolatry. So stating that Jesus cast the legion demon into pigs is another way to show that Jesus thought the legion or the Romans that they are impure and idolatrous. So the Romans were viewed as idolatrous because they worshipped at the altar of wealth, violence, and power.
And they did eat pigs.
Right. So the Gospels could have just said a man was suffering because he was being tormented by Romans. However, that is not how ancient or current writing works. Let's just start there. That's not how writing works. Yes. Metaphor and symbols have always been a significant part of human meaning making and storytelling, but also the Gospels were written down, again, after the first Jewish revolt, when many Jewish people were killed, just so much violence, enslaved, all of these things. So it was very dangerous during this time to be a follower of Jesus because Jesus was killed for being anti-Rome. The Gospels could not be directly or outright anti-Rome, or it would have been destroyed, right? And the Romans were not Jewish. They weren't intimately familiar with their understandings of pigs and these kinds of metaphors, right? So
that wasn't their culture.
Yes, if a Roman would have read this, maybe they could have been like, wait a second, is this against us? But they would have had a hard time arguing it. That's how literature works. That's how the Bible works, right? That's why we're still debating it 2,000 years later, because language can only get close to an experience, so we end up arguing about what is this actually. But again, it's not about a man with a demon that Jesus cast away. It is saying this man is being tormented by local soldiers. And Jesus is essentially telling this man, hey, it's all right. Me too. Us too. And let's just get rid of this torment. Put it on pigs, because these people, he's essentially telling this man, these Romans are idolatrous and they're unclean. Come with us. You're fine. You're safe with us. Anything to add to that story? I just love that story.
No, that's a great story.
But it's an example of how you got to dive in.
I love when that comes up in the lectionary, and the lectionary is assigned readings for Sundays in liturgical churches, and that usually comes during ordinary time, the green season.
Yeah.
And it's a good one.
Yeah. So I'm going to be a little, what people might call irreverent, but I don't think it's irreverent. Here's where a lot of this gets just downright funny, right? I think that it's actually, let me just say it. It gets downright funny. Jesus was anti-Rome. This isn't even up for debate at this point. Scholars don't argue about this. This isn't like a huge scandal in the church. It just is. Jesus was anti-Rome. People who study the Bible,
there's no question.
Theologians agree. There's no question about this. There aren't serious scholars or theologians who are like, oh no, Jesus had nothing to do with politics. Jesus had nothing to do with the Romans.
Nobody would say that.
Nobody would say that who studies this stuff. It's right there. And yet, so Jesus was anti-Rome. And the funny part is, Within a few hundred years after Jesus was killed by the Romans became followers of Jesus and even began reading the Gospels, which are against the Romans, which is crazy.
No.
There's more. Go ahead.
These Gospels in particular of Mark, I always say Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, because Mark comes first, even though in our Bibles it's...
Why does Matthew come first in our Bibles?
Because Matthew was seen as kind of, so you have the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament, and so you're coming off of this understanding of a Jewish context, right? Mm-hmm. And Matthew's gospel is a gospel that was written to a Jewish population, mm-hmm. and so you're going from Jewish kind of tradition, and you're leading into Jewish tradition, and then
more Greek.
More Greek. So you have which Mark and Luke are more Greek, and then obviously into John. So it makes sense for that, except
what
that
about Mark?
That Matthew. What do you mean?
You were going to say something about Mark. With Jesus being anti-Rome.
Oh, what I was going to say was Jesus was indeed anti-Rome, but he was anti-Roman establishment.
That's true. That's very true.
He was not against every single individual Roman person.
Yes.
He was against Roman the Roman emperor and the Senate and the kind of culture around violence and death and idolatry and
for sure, but it is the Roman establishment who made Christianity official. But it started to spread to Romans first. Well, let's talk about that, actually.
Yes, but there's a lot of debate here. But are you going to talk about Constantine? Is that what you're going to...
Yeah, but let's set it up, because that's actually good to talk about.
So one could say that many of these people in Rome, because remember we have the Gospels are not the first written texts from the New Testament. Paul's letters are.
Yes.
St. Paul's letters are.
Yes.
And we know that St. Paul had a historic ministry in Rome.
Can we actually stop and just very briefly, could you give a description of how the gospel spread and how the Christian story spread? Because
you mean the gospel in the story of Jesus, or the gospel
story.
Books?
Just the Jesus story. I don't care if it was written down or because there's some Greece stuff in there, and then eventually it found its way to Rome. So talk about how the Jesus story spread. It started in Jerusalem, in Cana. It started in Jesus' homeland.
So let's do this quickly. So there was in the very early...
Just be brief about it.
Yeah, in the very early days of the Jesus movement, so there was all kinds of little communities while Jesus was living. Mm-hmm. Right? There was all different types of basically home groups where Jesus was living.
And they were Jews.
And they were I shouldn't say predominantly. They were almost exclusively Jewish communities that accepted Jesus' teachings and accepted him as proclaiming as an authority, as the coming Messiah, and saw him as God's revelation.
Which is something that many Jews were waiting for,
many
and
Jews
they believed
were waiting
it to be
for
true in Jesus.
Right? And so then Jesus died.
Yes.
Jesus died, and there were still these small groups of basically Jewish communities, right? And then you had an expansion of people going beyond Jewish communities, and you had expansion, and there came to be eventually Gentile Christians, correct. So you had people like Romans and Greeks and people from the Egyptian, what we would now know as Egypt.
And Gentile just means non-Jew.
Non-Jew.
If I was listening to something like this 10 years ago, I would have been like,
I'm sorry. Yeah, we need to make that clear.
Gentile means non-Jew.
And so it was interesting because eventually, you're going to talk about this, but in 313, you get the Edict of Milan, and that eventually makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire.
Where was Paul spreading it?
But right. So Paul and Peter took Jesus's teachings and message.
I want to stop you. We are what can be considered Pauline Christians here in the United States, which means that we have inherited the story from Paul.
Or Petrine
Paul
Christians sometimes.
Yes, Paul and Peter are not the only ones who went and spread the Jesus story.
Correct.
Mary Magdalene,
Yep.
she went to a different area, but because she was, there's a lot of reasons. One of them being she was a woman, so it wasn't taken as seriously. Our version of Christianity has lifted up the voices of Peter and Paul, but they are not the only people.
Correct.
Many people who follow Jesus were sent out among different nations, but a huge reason is because the Roman Empire took a hold of the Paul and Peter message. That is what has survived in a large portion of the world. But it's not the only. They're not the only people who are doing that hard work.
Right, and so it's interesting because she doesn't get much.
Mary Magdalene.
Well, Mary Magdalene.
She gets written out of a lot, but she is very important.
So Mary Magdalene is the apostle to the apostles. We should actually do its own thing on that. But here's what I want to say first: is basically in the western regions of where the teachings of Jesus were shared. What you would find in Rome, okay, in the area of Rome, and you get Peter, so you get Saint Peter, and you get Saint Paul. Now, the interesting thing about Paul is that Paul also had a follower named Junia, and Saint Junia was a woman, and she had a very prominent thing. She's spoken about in the New Testament. So there was a woman along with Paul that was spreading the message of Jesus in these particular newer areas. So Paul writes to the church in Rome, right? Paul's epistle to Romans, or Paul's book to the Romans.
We have this letter in our Bible. It's called the Book of Romans.
Yeah. And he's speaking to the church, or the churches that of communities in Rome, and he's speaking to them in a very specific way to help instruct them in the teachings of Jesus, right? You also have Peter, who is sharing these messages, right? And then eventually, so Rome, in its understanding, Rome has always, from the very early beginning of the Christian story, Rome has always played a part.
Yeah.
It played a part in Jesus's death from the very beginning. It played a part in Jesus's. I'm going backwards here, but Jesus's birth. In that there was Herod, and he was, again, like we spoke about, close with the Romans, and there was a question of Jesus's birth: would he be killed or not? In the beginning,
during his whole lifetime,
his but
death.
Eventually in the 500s, you get the 5 established churches. You get the church in Jerusalem, which was the first. You get the church in Antioch. You get the church in Alexandria. You get the church in Constantinople, and you get the church in Rome. Right? And all 5 of these churches all had bishops. And all the bishops worked together, and there were multiple communities within Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Right? These are the 5 historic churches when Christianity actually became official. Right? And you see the workings.
Can I just stop you right there really quick before we get ahead?
Is this too much?
No, this is good. So Emperor Constantine. So I just want to summarize really quick because we just threw a lot of information. Jesus died. There were a lot of Jews who were following Jesus, and eventually the Jesus story spread to non-Jews called Gentiles. So you had these communities of Gentiles and Jews forming. It spread to a lot of places. One place was Rome. It was spread to Rome. And then Emperor Constantine, his Edict of Milan in the year 313, legalized Christianity. So it's hard to tell, was
he genuine or not?
Right. Was he genuine? That's debated. We're
nobody's ever going to know that.
Right. Did Constantine actually find value in the Christian story, the Jesus story, or did he realize, and again, you have this letter from Paul to the Romans, did he realize, wow, a lot of my population is adopting this religion? It wasn't Christianity yet, but there were a lot of Jesus followers. Some of them call themselves the Way. Some of them call themselves brothers in Christ, brothers and sisters in Christ, siblings in Christ.
They were Jesus communities.
They were Jesus communities. And he realized that a lot of the Roman population were kind of not converting, because conversion, there's nothing to convert to yet. But they were part of these communities. So then he decided, was it because he found the story of Jesus transformative, or was it because he wanted to keep control? That's up for debate. But nevertheless, in the year 313, he legalized Christianity. Christianity became an official thing, and that's how we get like all the creeds, right? Because Constantine quickly, again, he was a Roman emperor, and he quickly realized, oh wow, this thing that we're calling Christianity now, actually there's no one thing. Like all these communities believe different things. They don't even agree about who Jesus was.
Neither did Constantine. Many
Right.
historians argue that Constantine was probably an Arian Christian, which means that he did not believe that God the Creator, or God the Father, and God in Christ, God
Right.
with Jesus, were of
One and the
equality.
same. Right.
He believed that they were together, but he believed that Jesus was probably a little less.
Yes, and I've heard
and
it.
yet he was. I'm not even interested in arguing his genuineness to Christianity. Nobody's
'Cause you
ever going to
can't,
know
you
that.
never know.
But he was indeed baptized, which makes you officially a part of the church. His genuineness of it, who the hell knows?
Well, and with
you know.
him, I've read things by historians, Christian historians, saying Constantine, one of the reasons he might not have been pushing for seeing Jesus as equal to divinity is because that put his power in question.
Correct,
If there was a
correct.
human who walked this planet who can be seen as God, what does that mean for emperors who used to and were still kind of seen as divine in nature? So he didn't like that. Again, you have this Roman power all wrapped up in Christianity. So
And yet, what is very funny, because he might have personally had those thoughts, and some historians very much do lean into that, as Samantha had said. And yet, at the same time, we get the Apostles' and Nicene Creed, which clearly states that that's not the case.
yeah.
And that comes out of the Nicene Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Roman Catholicism was born. Now, remember, Catholic lowercase c means universal. Go ahead. Am I skipping a lot of context?
Yeah, not Roman Catholicism.
Well, there's Christianity, and then you've got the 5 churches and the 500s that you were talking about.
This was before. So these were the five churches.
Right.
So there was no such thing as Roman Catholicism as we know it today. These were Christian churches: the Church of Rome, the Church of Alexandria, the Church of Antioch, the Church of Jerusalem, and
Did you say Alexandria?
Alexandria.
You might have
I'm
said
missing
that
one.
twice. It doesn't matter. I listed it before.
But the 5 of them, and this was
Before Roman Catholicism.
Well, this was before the schism, the Great Schism.
Oh, right. Can I say something interesting?
Of 1066, which you love.
Which I do love.
So this was before this. They were unified.
That's right.
Well,
so I'm very Jewish history oriented. And then I understand a lot leading up to Constantine in the 300s. And then my Christian history between the 300s, now the Great Schism, I'm into the Great Schism in the 1000s, in the 1000s. But my Christian /Jewish history kind of stops between the 300s and the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s.
And there's a lot going on in there.
My dissertation was a lot about Protestant Reformation, and the book that I just wrote and the book I'm working on now is a lot of up until Constantine. Everything in between there, so what is that, 700, 1,000 years? I'm a little blurry, which is whenever Roman Catholicism came onto the scene officially. So,
what happened was the church in Rome, of the western part, they split off, and then the rest of them have remained.
Yeah. So just in
Orthodox.
conclusion, if you listen to our episode on power, the Jesus story is about everything. It's about our inner spiritual life, yes. It's about how we love, how we forgive, how we grieve. It's about life and death. It's about mourning, but it's also about the Romans and politics. It's about oppression and power. It's about money and wealth, right? It's about all of these things. And the strange thing about Christianity is that the Jesus story is a commentary about Jesus being against the Roman Empire and enslavement and the wealthy exploiting the poor. And yet Christianity and the Jesus story has been used to justify empire and enslavement and wealth and exploitation of the poor over and over again. So if you get nothing else out of this episode, just know this. We can't just read the Bible and expect the entire Jesus story to be made clear. We have to fully enter into the Jesus story. This is why Christianity is not just about sitting at home reading our Bibles alone. We go to church to hear sermons so we can go deeper into the story. We join Bible studies and book clubs so we can go deeper into the story. We read, we study, we discuss, we listen to podcasts.
And we sing hymns.
That's a good one. We sing hymns. And we just keep going deeper into it until the strange parts, like a demon named Legion being cast into a pig, moves us to understand how it's actually related to our lives here and now too. So there was a man who's being tormented by the political situation of his day. I'd like to say me too. Us too, right? And Jesus rid this man of his torment and likened the oppressive politicians to an unclean pig. Jesus was telling this man that the politicians who were causing his suffering were impure and idolatrous by following wealth instead of love and fighting for power instead of seeking the peace of God. This was a message for 2,000 years ago, but it is also a message for today. And this message will be lost if we forget that the Romans were there.
It's very good. It's very good. The Romans were definitely there, and you could see the evil that the Romans were in and the evil that the Romans have come from, and yet, just like we were talking about before with other things, there was still an openness, there was still a liberation to see that the people living in those regions today have come to understand the fullness of the story and see where they have come from and where they are going.
Yes. Okay, that's episode 24. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
To understand